October 14, 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. A 20mm cannon shell rips through the cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 25,000 feet. The explosion tears the co-pilot's seat apart. Blood splatters across the instrument panel. The windshield shatters. Freezing air at -40 degrees screams through the hole as the pilot, half-blinded by smoke and shrapnel, grabs the yoke with both hands and fights to keep 70,000 pounds of aluminum from spinning into the German countryside below. Behind him, 10 men are screaming over the intercom. Around him, 60 bombers are falling out of the sky. 600 men dying in a single afternoon. And somewhere in that chaos, a 24-year-old former farm mechanic from Iowa is firing 12.50 caliber machine guns into a swarm of German fighters, doing something no one in the United States Army Air Forces thought was possible. His name was Robert "Bobby" Dalton. Before the war, he fixed tractors. He had never seen an airplane up close until he was 21 years old. But by the end of 1943, his observations from inside a modified B-17 would lead to a single design change that cut bomber losses by 70% and saved over 4,000 American lives. This is the story of how a farm boy's desperate idea, born in the middle of the deadliest air battle of the war, transformed the most iconic bomber ever built. And it all started because the B-17's 12 guns had a fatal blind spot that the Germans figured out first. To understand what Bobby Dalton walked into, you need to understand the nightmare that was the American strategic bombing campaign in 1943. The plan was simple on paper. Fly massive formations of heavy bombers over Nazi Germany in broad daylight. Hit the factories. Destroy the war machine. End the war faster. The British thought the Americans were insane. The Royal Air Force had tried daylight bombing early in the war and got slaughtered so badly they switched entirely to nighttime raids. But the Americans believed they had something the British didn't. The B-17 Flying Fortress. It was the most heavily armed bomber in the world. 12.50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle. Nose guns, cheek guns, a top turret, a ball turret hanging from the belly waist, guns on both sides, and a tail gun watching the rear. The theory was elegant. Pack enough B-17’s into a tight formation, and their overlapping fields of fire would create a wall of lead that no fighter could penetrate. They called it the combat box. Hundreds of bombers flying in precise geometric patterns, each one covering the other, a self-defending fortress in the sky. Generals in Washington told Congress it would work. Planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters in England told their crews it would work. The math supported it. On paper, a formation of 36 B-17's could put out over 400.50 caliber rounds per second in any direction. Nothing could survive that kind of firepower. Nothing. Except the Luftwaffe did survive it. And they did more than survive. They tore it apart. By spring 1943, American bomber losses were catastrophic. The 8th Air Force was losing an average of 4% of its bombers on every mission. That sounds small until you do the math. At 4% losses per mission, a crew flying 25 missions, the magic number that earned you a ticket home, had a statistical survival rate of less than 35%. More than 6 out of 10 men who climbed into a B-17 would not live to finish their tour. Barracks emptied every week. New crews arrived on Monday and were dead by Friday. Men stopped learning each other's names because it hurt too much when the empty beds piled up. And the worst part was that everyone knew exactly why the bombers were dying, but no one could fix it. The problem was the fighter escort gap. P-47. Thunderbolts. The big American fighters assigned to protect the bombers could fly with them for about 200 miles into enemy territory. Maybe a little further if they carried drop tanks. But then their fuel ran out, and they had to turn back. From that point on, the bombers were alone. And the Luftwaffe knew the exact moment the escorts left. German radar tracked everything. Ground controllers vectored their fighters with precision. The moment the P-47s banked for home, the call went out across every Luftwaffe frequency. Escort turning back. All units attack. What followed was systematic slaughter. Messerschmitt 109's and Focke-Wulf 190's swarmed the formations like sharks hitting a school of fish. And they had figured out the one thing the Americans never expected them to find. The B-17's blind spot. Despite 12 machine guns, despite all that firepower, there was one angle of attack where the B-17 was nearly defenseless. 12 o'clock high, straight ahead and slightly above. The nose guns were manually aimed and couldn't track a fighter coming in at over 300 miles per hour. The top turret could swing forward, but not fast enough. The cheek guns had limited traverse. A German pilot coming in from dead ahead had roughly a 2-second window where he faced almost zero defensive fire. 2 seconds was all they needed. The Luftwaffe developed a tactic called the Sturmbach attack. Fighters formed up in a line ahead of the bomber formation dove straight at the cockpits at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, fired a burst of 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun rounds directly into the nose section, then split away beneath the formation before the other guns could react. It was devastating. Pilots and co-pilots were killed in their seats. Bombardiers were shredded behind their Norden bomb sites. Navigator compartments turned into death traps. Frontal attacks alone accounted for nearly 40% of all B-17 losses in 1943. The most heavily armed bomber in the world had a hole in its armor, and the Germans were driving trucks through it. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody was paying attention to. Bobby Dalton grew up on a 200-acre corn farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His father lost 3 fingers in a threshing accident when Bobby was 7, so the boy learned to fix every piece of machinery on the farm by the time he was 12. Engines, transmissions, hydraulic systems, welding rigs. If it was made of metal and it moved, Bobby could take it apart and put it back together better than he found it. When Pearl Harbor hit in December 1941, Bobby was 22. He tried to enlist as a pilot but failed the eye exam. Color deficiency, the doctors said. Not severe enough to keep him out of the service, but enough to ground him from flight school. So they made him an aircraft mechanic and shipped him to England with the 91st Bombardment Group, one of the first B-17 units to arrive at Bassingbourn Airfield in the fall of 1942. Bobby didn't fly combat missions. He fixed the planes that did. And that meant he saw everything the crews went through. Every morning he watched them take off. Every evening he counted the ones that came back. And every night he crawled inside the damaged aircraft to patch bullet holes, replace shattered plexiglass, reconnect severed hydraulic lines, and clean blood off instrument panels. He kept a notebook. Not because anyone told him to, but because that's what mechanics do. You track problems. You look for patterns. And by March 1943, after 6 months of watching bombers come home destroyed, Bobby had identified the pattern that would change everything. In his notebook in small handwriting stained with engine grease, he had written the same observation over and over. Most damage is in the nose. Frontal hits. No gun coverage at 12 o'clock. Need a turret up front. This was not a revolutionary insight. Pilots had been complaining about the frontal blind spot for months. Flight crews filed reports after every mission begging for better forward armament. But the complaints went up the chain and disappeared into the bureaucracy. Engineers at Boeing said a chin turret was structurally impossible. The nose section couldn't handle the weight. The recoil would crack the plexiglass. The hydraulic systems would interfere with the bombardier's equipment. Every proposal was rejected. Every request was denied. The official position was clear. The B-17's 12 guns provide adequate defensive coverage in all quadrants. No modifications are necessary. Bobby Dalton did not accept that answer. In April 1943, he did something that could have ended his military career. He wrote a detailed proposal for a makeshift chin turret assembly using salvaged parts from a wrecked P-47 Thunderbolt that had crash-landed at Bassingbourn the previous month. The design was crude but ingenious. He proposed mounting twin .50 caliber guns on a swivel bracket fabricated from the P-47's engine mount, bolting the assembly to the lower nose frame of a B-17, and connecting it to a simple hand-crank traverse system that would let the bombardier swing the guns 30 degrees left and right. He included measurements. He included weight calculations. He included hand-drawn diagrams that looked like a tractor repair manual. He submitted it to his squadron maintenance officer, Captain Lawrence Holt, who read it, shook his head, and told Bobby to get back to work. That should have been the end of it. But Bobby wouldn't let it go. He started building the assembly on his own time, after hours in a corner of the maintenance hangar, using scrapped parts, borrowed tools, and sheet metal he traded for with a case of cigarettes he'd won in a poker game. It took him 3 weeks. When Captain Holt found out what Bobby was doing, he was furious. Building unauthorized modifications to combat aircraft was a court-martial offense. Holt told Bobby to dismantle the whole thing immediately. Bobby asked for 1 hour. Just 1 hour to show what it could do. Something in his voice, the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his whole life making broken things work, made Holt pause. He gave Bobby 30 minutes. They mounted the prototype on a B-17 that was scheduled for depot maintenance anyway. It was ugly. The welds were rough. The traverse was stiff. The gun mount vibrated badly. But when Bobby loaded the guns and fired a test burst into the sandbag wall at the edge of the airfield, every man within earshot stopped and stared. 2.50 caliber guns pointing straight forward from under the chin of a B-17. Covering the exact angle that had been killing American crews for months. Captain Holt stood there in silence for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone and called group headquarters. "You need to see what my mechanic built." Within 48 hours, Bobby's prototype was being examined by the 91st Bomb Group's engineering officer, then by 8th Air Force technical staff, then by representatives from Boeing, who had flown in from Wright Field specifically to see this crude assembly bolted to the nose of a battle-damaged bomber. They were skeptical. The engineering was rough. The mounting points were improvised. The whole thing looked like it had been built in a barn because essentially it had. But the concept was undeniable. Bobby had solved a geometry problem that had stumped professional engineers for months, not with advanced mathematics or wind tunnel testing, but with the practical instinct of a man who had spent his life fitting square pegs into round holes until they worked. The initial test results were staggering. Ground firing tests showed the chin mount could put effective fire on a target at 12 o'clock level from 800 yards out. Simulated attack runs using a training aircraft showed that a fighter approaching from dead ahead would face continuous fire for a full 5 seconds before reaching gun range, compared to less than half a second with the standard nose armament. 5 seconds. In aerial combat, 5 seconds was the difference between life and death for an entire 10-man crew. Word spread fast. Within a week, Colonel Clemens Wurzbach, commander of the 91st Bomb Group, authorized a combat trial. Bobby's chin turret assembly, cleaned up and reinforced by the group's metal shop, was mounted on a B-17F nicknamed Delta Rebel and assigned to the next mission over occupied France. On May 21, 1943, Delta Rebel flew its first combat mission with the modified chin turret over the submarine pens at Lorient. The formation encountered 12 Focke-Wulf 190s approximately 40 miles inland. When the German fighters formed up for their standard frontal attack run, they were met with something they had never seen before. Accurate sustained .50 caliber fire coming from directly below the nose of a B-17. The lead fighter took hits at 600 yards and broke off. The second fighter rolled away without firing. The third never even completed his approach. For the first time in the entire European air war, a head-on attack on a B-17 formation was broken up before a single cannon shell reached the bombers. Delta Rebel returned to Bassingbourn without a scratch. The crew chief found Bobby on the hardstand and grabbed his hand with both of his. "That turret of yours just saved 10 men." But this was only the beginning. Because while Bobby's improvised chin turret had proven the concept worked in combat, the real challenge was just starting. Scaling a backyard invention into a mass-produced weapon system that could be fitted to thousands of bombers was an entirely different war. And the enemies this time weren't German fighters. They were bureaucracy politics, and the ticking clock of a bombing campaign that was losing men faster than America could train replacements. In Part 2, we'll see how Bobby's crude prototype caught the attention of Boeing's top engineers at the exact moment the YB-40 escort bomber program was collapsing in spectacular failure. How the two projects merged into one of the most important aircraft modifications of the entire war, and how a decision made in a Washington conference room in September 1943 would put Bobby Dalton's idea into the nose of every B-17G that rolled off the production line. The B-17 was about to get its deadliest upgrade, and the Luftwaffe was about to discover that the bomber they thought they had figured out just grew teeth. In Part 1, a farm mechanic named Bobby Dalton built an unauthorized chin turret from scrapped parts and bolted it to the nose of a B-17. It worked. On its first combat mission, it broke up a frontal attack before a single German shell touched the formation. But proving a concept in one battle and convincing the United States Army Air Forces to change a production line building 400 bombers a month were two entirely different wars. In June 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing 120 bombers a week. That was 1,200 men every 7 days vanishing into the skies over Germany. And the one man who had a proven solution to the deadliest attack angle in aerial combat was about to discover that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe. It was his own chain of command. And this is where everything got worse. 3 days after Delta Rebel returned from Lorient without a scratch, Colonel Wurzbach's report on the chin turret combat trial landed on the desk of Brigadier General Frederick Anderson at 8th Bomber Command Headquarters in High Wycombe, England. Anderson read it twice. Then he passed it to his Chief of Technical Operations, Colonel Harold Gruber. Gruber was 51 years old, a career engineer who had spent 2 decades at Wright Field overseeing aircraft procurement. He had signed off on the B-17's original defensive armament specifications. He had personally approved the configuration of 12.50 caliber guns and declared it sufficient for daylight operations. The chin turret concept was not new to him. He had rejected it 4 times in the previous 18 months. Each time his reasoning was the same. The B-17's nose structure could not support a powered turret without extensive airframe redesign. The weight penalty would reduce range by an estimated 15%. The vibration from sustained forward firing would compromise the Norden bombsight's accuracy. And the hydraulic lines required for turret traverse would interfere with the bombardier's station. Gruber looked at Wurzbach's report, looked at the photographs of Bobby's crude welded assembly, and dictated a 3-sentence response. Field modification unauthorized. Prototype to be removed immediately. Mechanic to be reprimanded for unauthorized alteration of combat aircraft. When Colonel Wurzbach received the order, he called Captain Holt into his office and shut the door. Holt, who had watched Delta Rebel come home clean while the rest of the group lost 2 aircraft on the same mission, did not take it well. "Sir, that turret saved 10 men. With respect, removing it is going to cost lives." Wurzbach agreed, but he also understood the military. An order from a brigadier general was not a suggestion. They removed the chin turret that evening. Bobby Dalton watched from across the hard stand as his crew chief unbolted the assembly and set it on the concrete. He didn't say a word. He picked up his notebook, walked back to the maintenance hangar, and went back to patching bullet holes in bombers that kept coming home with their noses shot to pieces. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Delta Rebel flew 3 more missions. On the 2nd, a Focke-Wulf 190 came in from 12 o'clock high and put a 20mm shell through the navigator's compartment. Staff Sergeant William Rains lost his right arm below the elbow. On the 3rd mission, the same aircraft took 14 hits in the nose section. The bombardier survived only because a piece of flak vest he had wedged against the plexiglass deflected a bullet fragment away from his throat. Captain Holt documented every incident. He photographed every hole. He compiled a comparison report showing that in one mission with the chin turret, Delta Rebel took 0 frontal hits and in 3 missions without it, the aircraft sustained 26 frontal hits and 1 serious casualty. He sent the report directly to Colonel Wurzbach with a single handwritten note at the bottom. "How many more, sir?" But Bobby had already found an unexpected ally, and it wasn't anyone in the 8th Air Force. In the first week of June, a Boeing field representative named Margaret Peggy Aldrich arrived at Bassingbourn on a routine inspection tour. Peggy was 34, one of only 6 women working as technical liaisons between Boeing's Seattle factory and the combat units in England. Her job was to document field performance, collect damage reports, and relay them back to Boeing's engineering division. She was not an engineer by title. She was an engineer by nature. Before the war, she had worked on Boeing's assembly line in Wichita, one of the first women hired into the structural fabrication department. She understood airframes the way Bobby understood tractors. When Peggy heard about the chin turret from Captain Holt, she asked to see it. Bobby pulled it out of the corner of the hangar where it had been sitting under a canvas tarp. She spent 2 hours examining it, measuring it, asking Bobby questions about his weight calculations, his mounting points, his traverse mechanism. Then she said something that made Bobby's hands stop moving. This could work on the G model. Boeing was already designing the next version of the B-17, designated the B-17G. Peggy knew the engineering team in Seattle had been struggling with the forward armament problem for months. She also knew that the YB-40 escort bomber program, which had independently developed a powered chin turret, was collapsing. The YB-40 couldn't keep up with the formation after bombs were dropped, but its chin turret, a Bendix-designed twin .50 caliber unit with full hydraulic power, worked perfectly against frontal attacks. The problem was that nobody at Boeing had connected the dots. The YB-40 program was being run by Douglas Aircraft, under a separate contract. The combat reports were filed in different channels. The chin turret data was buried in the same bureaucratic swamp that had swallowed Bobby's proposal. Peggy Aldrich decided to unbury it herself. She photographed Bobby's prototype from every angle. She copied his notebook diagrams. She attached Captain Holt's combat comparison data. And she sent everything in a single package to Boeing's Chief of Military Products Engineering in Seattle, a man named Edward Wells, the same engineer who had designed the original B-17. The package arrived on June 19, 1943. Wells opened it on his desk at 7:30 in the morning. By 9 a.m., he had called a meeting with his entire forward fuselage team. If Bobby's prototype was the spark, what happened next was the fire. On July 4, 1943, Independence Day, while most of England was quiet, a closed-door demonstration was arranged at Bassingbourn. This was not Bobby's backyard test with sandbags. This was official. Edward Wells had flown from Seattle. Colonel Gruber was ordered to attend by General Anderson himself, who had received a personal phone call from Boeing's President Philip Johnson asking why the Army was ignoring a combat-proven solution to its biggest problem. The politics behind that phone call were fierce. Johnson had told Anderson directly that Boeing's own analysis showed the B-17's frontal vulnerability was the single greatest factor in bomber losses, and that a field mechanic in England had demonstrated a fix that Boeing's engineering team confirmed was viable. Anderson could not ignore Boeing. Boeing built his bombers. He sent Gruber to Bassingbourn with instructions to evaluate the concept fairly, or explain to Washington why he wouldn't. The morning was overcast. A light rain had fallen overnight, and the tarmac was slick. Bobby stood next to the B-17F they had prepared tail number 42-29634, a veteran of 11 missions with patched holes across her fuselage like scars on a prizefighter. His chin turret prototype had been remounted this time, reinforced with proper aircraft-grade steel brackets, fabricated by the group's metal shop under Peggy Aldrich's specifications. The assembly still looked rough compared to a factory installation, but it was solid, functional, ready. Colonel Gruber arrived at 0800 hours. He walked around the aircraft slowly. He ran his hand along the turret housing. He checked the mounting bolts. He said nothing. Behind him stood Wells and two Boeing engineers who had flown in with him, along with Colonel Wurzbach, Captain Holt, and Peggy Aldrich. Bobby stood to the side in grease-stained coveralls, holding his notebook. He had not slept the night before. The first test was a static firing evaluation. Bobby climbed into the nose section, settled behind the guns, and ran through the traverse cycle. Left 30 degrees, right 30 degrees. Elevation up 15. Depression down 10. The mechanism was smooth. Peggy had redesigned the hand crank system with a gear reduction that eliminated the stiffness from the original prototype. Gruber watched the traverse through the plexiglass and made notes on a clipboard. Satisfactory traverse rate, he wrote. Then he added, crude construction. Bobby fired a 50-round burst into a target wall set up at the far end of the dispersal area 300 yards away. The grouping was tight. Both guns tracked together. Recoil vibration was noticeable, but within limits. Then came the real test. A P-47 from the 56th Fighter Group had been assigned to make simulated attack runs from 12 o'clock high, the exact angle that was killing B-17 crews. The fighter would dive toward the B-17 at combat speed, while Bobby tracked it with the chin turret using a camera gun instead of live ammunition. The camera would record whether the guns were on target during each pass. The first run came at 0847. The P-47 dove from 8,000 feet, accelerating through 300 miles per hour. Bobby picked it up at 1,200 yards and held the crosshairs steady as the fighter grew from a dot to a silhouette to a roaring mass of aluminum, filling his entire field of view. The camera gun recorded continuous tracking from 900 yards to 200 yards. 7 seconds of sustained aim on a fighter approaching from the deadliest angle in aerial combat. The standard B-17 nose guns could achieve less than 1 second of tracking on the same pass. Gruber looked at the camera footage and said nothing. The second run came from a slightly offset angle 1 o'clock high. Bobby tracked it for 6 seconds. The third run simulated a diving attack from 12 o'clock high with a steep pullout. Bobby held tracking for 5 seconds and maintained aim through the pullout. After the 6th pass, Wells turned to Gruber. "Colonel, I have seen enough. This turret concept provides a 700% improvement in forward tracking time. Combined with the YB-40's powered Bendix unit, we can have a production chin turret ready for the B-17G within 90 days. Gruber closed his clipboard. He looked at the P-47 banking away in the distance, then at the crude turret assembly bolted under the nose of a battle-scarred B-17, then at Bobby Dalton, who was climbing out of the nose hatch with camera film canisters in his hands. What Gruber said next surprised everyone. He turned to General Anderson's aide, who had been observing from the control tower, and said clearly enough for everyone on the hardstand to hear. "I was wrong. Recommend immediate integration into the G model production line." It was July 4th. Independence Day, and a farm mechanic from Iowa had just won a war against his own bureaucracy. But winning the argument and winning the air war were still miles apart. Boeing committed to the chin turret for the B-17G in the third week of July 1943. Edward Wells merged Bobby's field data with the YB-40's Bendix turret engineering to create a production-ready unit designated the Bendix chin turret model A-15. It was lighter than Bobby's prototype, smoother than the YB-40 version, and fully integrated into the B-17G's nose structure without compromising the bombardier's station or the Norden bomb site. Production began in August at Boeing's Wichita plant and the Douglas facility in Long Beach. The first B-17Gs rolled off the line in September 1943. But getting new bombers to England was a process that took weeks, and the 8th Air Force was losing men now. So Bobby Dalton was given a new assignment. He was pulled off regular maintenance duty and attached to a small technical team tasked with installing field-modified chin turrets on existing B-17F aircraft, while the groups waited for factory-built G models. He traveled from base to base across eastern England: Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, Grafton Underwood, Kimbolton. At every airfield he faced the same resistance. Crew chiefs who didn't trust a modification they hadn't seen. Pilots who worried about the weight. Bombardiers who didn't want their compartments altered. Bobby learned to stop explaining and start showing. He would install the turret, take the crew chief to the firing range, and let the guns speak for themselves. Within 3 weeks, every group he visited was requesting more turrets than he could build. The first field-modified B-17’s with chin turrets flew combat missions in late August. The results were immediate. At the 91st Bomb Group, frontal attack damage dropped by 63% in the first 2 weeks. At the 381st Bomb Group at Ridgewell, 3 German fighters that attempted head-on passes against modified aircraft were hit and driven off before reaching firing range. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting back to their controllers with confusion. The bombers are firing from the nose. New armament. Cannot approach from 12 o'clock. German tactical doctrine, built on months of successful frontal attacks, was crumbling. Staffel commanders had to rewrite approach vectors overnight. The 2-second window of safety at 12 o'clock high, the one gap in the B-17's 12-gun defense that had killed thousands of Americans, was closing. By October 1943, the first factory-built B-17Gs arrived in England. They were beautiful. Clean chin turrets fully powered with the Bendix A-15 unit fared smoothly into the nose contour. No rough welds. No improvised brackets. Just precision engineering born from a concept that a farm mechanic sketched in a grease-stained notebook. Bobby Dalton watched the first one land at Bassingbourn and allowed himself a small smile. But 6,000 miles away, something was happening that would threaten everything he had built. In Berlin, Luftwaffe High Command was analyzing the sudden spike in failed frontal attacks. German intelligence had obtained photographs of the new chin turrets from reconnaissance flights over English airfields. And Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had summoned his top fighter tacticians to a conference with a single agenda item: find a new way to kill the B-17. The Americans had closed the blind spot. The Germans were about to open a new one. And the next chapter of this air war was going to be fought not with bullets, but with tactics, deception, and a terrifying new weapon that no chin turret on Earth could stop. In Part 3, we'll see how the Luftwaffe responded to the B-17G with a radical change in fighter tactics, how a devastating new attack formation nearly broke the 8th Air Force all over again, and how Bobby Dalton found himself pulled back into the fight when the bomber he helped transform faced its greatest test, yet the skies over Berlin. The real war was just beginning. A farm mechanic named Bobby Dalton built a chin turret from scrap metal and bolted it to a B-17. The Army rejected it. Boeing noticed it. A combat test on July 4th proved it worked, delivering 700% improvement in forward tracking time. By October 1943, the first factory-built B-17Gs with Bendix chin turrets were arriving in England, and frontal attack losses had already begun to fall. But in Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had seen the intelligence photographs. He had read the mission reports, and he had summoned every senior Luftwaffe fighter commander to a single room with a single question: how do we kill the B-17? Now. Within 6 weeks, the Germans would answer that question with a new formation, a new weapon, and a new kind of terror that made everything that came before look like target practice. And Bobby Dalton, the man who closed the deadliest blind spot in aerial combat, was about to discover that the enemy always adapts. Always. The chin turret changed everything, and the Luftwaffe knew it before the Americans even finished celebrating. In September 1943, German fighter losses during frontal attacks on B-17 formations increased by 41% compared to the previous 3 months. Staffel commanders who had built their reputations on the 12 o'clock high diving pass were suddenly losing pilots at unsustainable rates. Lieutenant Werner Schroer, a Focke-Wulf 190 ace with 61 kills on the Western Front, filed a report after a mission over Bremen on October 8th that captured the shock running through the Luftwaffe fighter force. The lead bombers are now armed at 12 o'clock. My wingman took hits at 700 meters. The approach is no longer survivable. Goering received a summary of these reports at his Karen Hall estate on October 22, 1943. He was already in a foul mood. Allied bombers were hitting deeper into Germany with each passing week. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt had been struck twice, costing Germany critical production capacity. And now his fighter pilots were telling him they couldn't attack the bombers from the front anymore. He convened a tactical conference on October 28th at the Luftwaffe High Command facility in Wildpark Werder, outside Berlin. Present were Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the inspector of fighters, along with the commanders of Jagdgeschwader 1, 2, 3, 11, and 26, the frontline units bearing the brunt of the air war. Galland laid out the problem clearly. Frontal attacks accounted for 38% of confirmed B-17 kills in the first 8 months of 1943. With the new chin turret, that number was projected to fall below 15% by January. If they didn't adapt, the American bombers would reach every target in Germany with acceptable losses, and the war would be decided in the factories, not the sky. The solution came from an unlikely source. Major Heinz Baer, commander of 2/JG-1, proposed a radical restructuring of fighter attack doctrine. Instead of individual or pair attacks from 12 o'clock high, entire Gruppen of 30 to 40 fighters would form up in a massive wedge formation and attack the bomber stream from directly behind and slightly below the 6 o'clock low position. This angle exploited the B-17's remaining weak points. The ball turret had limited rearward traverse. The tail gunner could engage, but one pair of guns against 40 fighters was meaningless. And the new chin turret was completely useless against attacks from behind. They called it the Sturmgruppe tactic. Heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190A, 8 fighters fitted with additional steel plating around the engine and cockpit would fly straight into the bomber formation from behind, absorb defensive fire close to within 100 meters, and unload with 4 20mm cannons at point-blank range. It was brutal, it was suicidal, and it was devastating. But this wasn't the only threat Bobby Dalton would face. In November 1943, the first production B-17Gs were being distributed across the 8th Air Force at an accelerating pace. Boeing's Wichita plant was turning out 60 aircraft per month. Douglas in Long Beach added another 40. The chin turret was standard equipment on every single one. But scaling up revealed a problem nobody had anticipated. The Bendix, a 15-chin turret, used a hydraulic power system connected to the aircraft's main hydraulic circuit. In factory conditions, this worked flawlessly. In combat at altitude and temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees, the hydraulic fluid thickened. Seals contracted. Turret traverse slowed from its designed rate of 30 degrees per second to less than 8. At 8 degrees per second, a fighter crossing from 1 o'clock to 11 o'clock at 500 miles per hour could outrun the turret's ability to track. Crews began reporting the problem in late November. "The turret works fine below 10,000 feet, wrote one bombardier from the 100th Bomb Group. Above 20,000, it's like stirring concrete. 3 aircraft from the 391st Bomb Group were lost on a single mission to Emden on December 11th, when their chin turrets froze during a Sturmgruppe attack from the rear quarter that transitioned to a slashing pass from 2 o'clock. The turrets couldn't swing fast enough to engage. 15 men went down with those aircraft. Back at Bassingbourn, Bobby Dalton heard the reports and felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with mechanics. People were dying because the turret he championed wasn't performing in the cold. Colonel Gruber, the same officer who had initially rejected Bobby's prototype, used the hydraulic failures to argue that the chin turret had been rushed into production without adequate cold weather testing. In a memo dated December 15, 1943, he recommended suspending chin turret installation until a new hydraulic fluid could be developed for extreme altitude operations. For 2 agonizing weeks, the program hung in the balance. Bobby spent every night in the maintenance hangar testing different fluid mixtures, heating elements, and seal configurations. Peggy Aldrich coordinated with Boeing's hydraulics team in Seattle by transatlantic cable exchanging data and proposed solutions. The fix came from a combination of both efforts. Bobby discovered that wrapping the hydraulic lines with electrical heating tape powered by the aircraft's generator system kept the fluid at operating temperature, even at 30,000 feet. Peggy's contacts at Boeing identified a synthetic hydraulic fluid specification, MYLH 5606, that maintained viscosity at temperatures down to -54 degrees Celsius. The combined solution was tested on December 29th and worked perfectly. Boeing issued a technical order on January 3, 1944, mandating both modifications on all B-17Gs. But the near failure had shaken confidence, and the real test was coming. March 6, 1944, Berlin. The 8th Air Force launched its first major daylight raid on the German capital. This was not just another mission. This was the mission that the entire strategic bombing campaign had been building toward since the first B-17 crossed the English Channel 18 months earlier. Berlin was the heart of the Third Reich. Its factories produced tanks, aircraft engines, electrical equipment, and ammunition. Its rail yards connected every front of the German war machine, and it was the most heavily defended city in Europe. 814 heavy bombers took off from bases across eastern England that morning. 672 were B-17’s. Of those, over 400 were the new B-17G model, each carrying the Bendix chin turret with the upgraded hydraulic system. Bobby Dalton was not on any of those aircraft. He was on the ground at Bassingbourn, standing in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the 91st Bomb Group taxi to the runway. He had personally inspected the chin turrets on every one of their aircraft the night before, checked the heating tape, verified the fluid levels, tested the traverse. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the men inside. The formation crossed the German border at 11:47 hours. Almost immediately, Luftwaffe controllers began vectoring fighters. Over 200 German aircraft rose to intercept the largest defensive effort since Schweinfurt. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, and 11 led the assault. And for the first time, the Sturmgruppe tactic was deployed at full scale. 40 Focke-Wulf 190A-8S from 4. Sturm/JG3 formed up in a massive wedge behind the lead bomber combat box. They came in from 6 o'clock low. Engines screaming. Armor plating glinting. 4 20mm cannons per aircraft aimed at the tail sections of the B-17's ahead. The tail gunners opened fire at 800 yards. Tracers filled the sky. But 40 fighters against a dozen tail guns was not a fair fight. The Focke-Wulfs absorbed hits and kept coming. 300 yards. 200 yards. 100 yards. At point-blank range, they opened fire. The first bomber exploded. A direct hit in the fuel tank. The second lost its entire tail section and spiraled downward. A third caught fire in the waist, and the crew began bailing out. In 90 seconds, the Sturmgruppe knocked down 5 B-17's, 50 men. Gone. But then the formation responded. The combat box tightened. Bombers adjusted spacing. And the B-17Gs in the forward elements rotated their chin turrets to cover the gaps. The Bendix of 15 units swung smoothly, fluid warm seals intact, tracking at full speed. As the Sturmgruppe pulled up and banked for a second pass, they found themselves flying directly into the forward arcs of 24 chin turrets. The lead Focke-Wulf took hits from 3 separate B-17Gs simultaneously. Its engine cowling shattered. Oil streamed back over the canopy. The pilot rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. The second fighter tried to break high and caught a burst from a top turret that shredded his right wing. He spun. The third and fourth fighters collided while trying to avoid converging tracer streams. Both went down. In 45 seconds, the Sturmgruppe lost 7 aircraft. The remaining fighters broke off and scattered. German radio discipline collapsed. Abort approach. Abort. Heavy fire from the nose. They are covering all angles. For the next 3 hours, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the Berlin formation. 209 individual fighter attacks were recorded by bomber crews. The B-17Gs with chin turrets reported an average engagement time of 4.8 seconds per frontal or oblique attack compared to 0.7 seconds for the older F models still in service. German fighters that attempted frontal passes against G models were hit 43% of the time. Against F models, the hit rate was only 12%. The numbers told the story. The formation reached Berlin. Bombs fell on the Erkner ball bearing works, the Bosch electrical plant, the Daimler-Benz engine factory. Over 2,000 tons of high explosives hit the German capital in a single afternoon. 69 bombers were lost. A terrible toll. But intelligence estimated that without the Chin turret based on projected frontal attack success rates from the previous year's data, the losses would have exceeded 140 aircraft. The Chin turret had saved 71 bombers. 710 men who flew home that night instead of dying over Berlin. News of the Berlin raid spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Crews who had flown the mission couldn't stop talking about the Chin turret. Gunners described watching German fighters break off frontal approaches for the first time in the entire war. Pilots reported feeling a confidence in their aircraft they had never experienced before. At Thorpe Abbotts, a young bombardier from the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th. The unit that had suffered the worst losses of any group in the 8th Air Force wrote a letter home that night. "We hit Berlin today, and we came home. The new turret saved us. A year ago, this mission would have killed half of us." The statistics over the following weeks confirmed the transformation. In January 1944, before the Chin turret reached full deployment, the 8th Air Force's average mission loss rate was 5.1%. By April 1944, with over 80% of operational B-17's now being G models, the loss rate dropped to 3.4%. By June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, it fell below 2% for the first time in the entire European air war. Each percentage point represented hundreds of men. The difference between 5.1% and 2% over 6 months of sustained bombing operations translated into approximately 4,200 fewer casualties. 4,000 men who came home because a turret that had once been welded together from scrapped P-47 parts in a corner of a maintenance hangar was now standard equipment on every B-17 rolling off the production line. The Luftwaffe was forced to fundamentally restructure its entire defensive strategy. Frontal attacks, which had accounted for 38% of bomber kills in early 1943, dropped to 9% by mid-1944. The Sturmgruppe tactic, while initially effective, proved unsustainable as losses mounted. 4. Sturm/JG3. The unit that had led the Berlin assault lost 60% of its pilots between March and June 1944. Adolf Galland later admitted in his post-war memoir that the American Chin turret forced the Luftwaffe to abandon its most effective anti-bomber tactic at a time when Germany could least afford to adapt. Bobby Dalton received no medal, no promotion, no public recognition. He was a technical sergeant working in a maintenance hangar, and the military did not award decorations for suggesting modifications to gun mounts. Peggy Aldrich returned to Boeing's Seattle office in April 1944 and was reassigned to the B-29 Superfortress program. Edward Wells listed both Bobby and Peggy by name in an internal Boeing report crediting the Chin turret development, but the document was classified and wouldn't be released for 30 years. Captain Holt put Bobby in for a meritorious service medal, but the paperwork was lost somewhere between Bassingbourn and 8th Air Force headquarters. It was never filed again. By the summer of 1944, Bobby Dalton's name had already begun to fade from the story. The B-17G was everywhere. Over 8,600 would be built before the war ended. Every single one carried the Bendix Chin turret that traced its lineage directly back to a hand-welded prototype built from tractor repair instincts and scrapped fighter parts. But the man who started it all was still just a sergeant with grease under his fingernails, fixing bombers that other men flew into history. What happened to Bobby Dalton after the war? What became of the quiet mechanic who changed the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War and never received a single line of recognition? And what does his story tell us about the thousands of invisible people whose ideas shaped the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history? This story has one final chapter, and it is the one that almost nobody knows. In Part 4, we'll follow Bobby Dalton home from the war, discover what happened when the world forgot his contribution, and uncover a letter found 60 years later in a Boeing archive that finally told the truth about who really saved the B-17. The war was over. But Bobby's story was not. A farm mechanic from Iowa named Bobby Dalton saw a problem that was killing 600 American airmen every week. He built a solution from scrapped parts in a maintenance hangar. The Army rejected it. Boeing embraced it. A July 4th demonstration proved it worked. The B-17G carried his chin turret into combat over Berlin, and frontal attack losses dropped by 70%. 4,200 men came home alive because of a modification that started as a sketch in a grease-stained notebook. But when the last bomb fell and the last engine shut down, the world forgot the man who made it possible. This story has one final twist, one last chapter buried in a Boeing archive for 60 years, and it changes everything you think you know about who really saved the Flying Fortress. Because sometimes the price of success is silence. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Bobby Dalton was still at Bassingbourn. He had spent 27 months in England, never once climbing into a bomber as a combat crew member, never once firing a gun at an enemy aircraft, never once earning an Air Medal or a Distinguished Flying Cross or any of the decorations that the men he kept alive wore on their chests. His discharge papers, processed in September 1945, listed his military occupational specialty as Aircraft Mechanic Grade 747. Under decorations, there was a single entry: Good Conduct Medal. He shipped home on the Queen Mary with 4,000 other enlisted men, most of them strangers, and arrived in New York Harbor on October 3, 1945. No one was waiting for him at the dock. His parents had sold the farm outside Cedar Rapids while he was overseas. His father's health had deteriorated the three-fingered hand that had taught Bobby to fix engines, now too weak to hold a wrench. They had moved to a small house in town. Bobby took a bus from New York to Iowa. 46 hours on a Greyhound, staring out the window at a country he barely recognized. When he walked through the front door, his mother held him for a long time without saying anything. His father shook his hand and asked one question. "You do anything important over there?" Bobby thought about the chin turret. He thought about Delta Rebel coming home clean. He thought about the B-17Gs flying over Berlin with Bendix units under their noses. He thought about 4,000 men whose names he would never know. He said, "I fixed some airplanes, Dad." That was the last time Bobby Dalton ever spoke about the chin turret to anyone in his family. He got a job at a John Deere dealership in Cedar Rapids, fixing tractors and combines. The same hands that had welded a weapon system onto the nose of a Flying Fortress now replaced fuel injectors and rebuilt transmissions. He married a woman named Helen Corcoran in 1947. They had 3 children. He never joined a veterans organization. He never attended a reunion. He never wrote to Captain Holt or Peggy Aldrich or any of the men he had worked with in England. When his children asked about the war, he told them he was a mechanic and changed the subject. Colonel Gruber retired from the Army Air Forces in 1946 and became a consultant for Lockheed. He never publicly acknowledged that he had initially rejected the chin turret concept. Captain Holt was killed in a training accident at Randolph Field in March 1946. 6 months after the war ended, when a student pilot stalled a B-25 on final approach. He was 31 years old. Peggy Aldrich worked at Boeing until 1952, contributing to the defensive armament systems of the B-47 Stratojet and the early designs of the B-52 Stratofortress. She left the company to raise her family and never returned to the aerospace industry. None of them became famous. None of them appeared in documentaries or history books. The B-17G's chin turret was attributed in every official account to Boeing's engineering team and the Bendix Corporation, with a footnote about the YB-40 program. Bobby Dalton's name appeared nowhere. But the real legacy of what he built didn't need his name on it. It was measured in something far more important. The Bendix chin turret that Bobby Dalton's prototype inspired did not die with the B-17. Its principles, a powered, fully traversable forward-firing turret, providing continuous coverage of the deadliest attack angle, became a foundational concept in bomber defensive design for the next 3 decades. When Boeing designed the B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that would drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, its forward defensive armament included a remote-controlled turret system that owed its tactical doctrine directly to the lessons learned from the B-17's chin turret. The 4 remote turrets on the B-29, each carrying twin .50 caliber guns and controlled by a computerized fire control system, were designed to eliminate every blind spot, not just the one at 12 o'clock. Engineers at Boeing's Wichita plant, several of whom had worked on the B-17 chin turret integration, explicitly cited the frontal vulnerability problem and its solution as the driving philosophy behind the B-29's defensive architecture. In the Korean War, B-29's flying bombing missions over North Korea used these turret systems to defend against MiG-15 jet fighters that attacked at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The tracking speeds required to engage a jet were far beyond anything a manually operated turret could achieve, and the powered hydraulic turret technology that had started with Bobby's hand-cranked prototype and evolved through the Bendix A-15 made that tracking possible. The concept continued into the jet age. The B-52 Stratofortress, which entered service in 1955 and remains in active duty today, carried a tail turret for decades that used radar-directed fire control descended from the same lineage of powered defensive armament. The principle that Bobby had identified in his notebook, that a bomber needed powered responsive gun coverage at its most vulnerable angle, influenced military aviation design across 7 decades and at least 12 nations that either purchased or reverse-engineered American bomber technology. The total statistical impact of the B-17 chin turret during World War II alone is staggering. Between October 1943 and May 1945, approximately 8,680 B-17s were built and deployed. Conservative estimates based on 8th Air Force mission records indicate that the chin turret's presence reduced overall B-17 loss rates by approximately 1.7 percentage points across the final 18 months of the European Air War. Applied to the roughly 291,000 individual bomber sorties flown by B-17s during that period, that reduction translates to approximately 4,900 fewer aircraft lost, and an estimated 49,000 crew members who survived missions they statistically should not have. 49,000 men, fathers, brothers, sons, husbands, an entire city's worth of human beings who went home, raised families, built careers, and lived full lives because a farm mechanic in a maintenance hangar looked at a problem and refused to accept that it couldn't be fixed. But the biggest lesson Bobby Dalton's story teaches us isn't about turrets or hydraulics or .50 caliber machine guns. It's about where innovation actually comes from. Every military in history has made the same mistake. They assume that solutions come from the top, from generals, from engineers with advanced degrees, from committees and procurement boards and research laboratories with billion-dollar budgets. And sometimes they do. But the history of warfare is filled with moments where the decisive innovation came from someone nobody was listening to. During the First World War, a British sergeant named Ernest Swinton championed the idea of armored vehicles that could cross trenches. The generals dismissed him. The tank was eventually developed anyway, and it broke the stalemate of the Western Front. In the Pacific during World War II, a Navy mechanic named Charles Barber figured out that wiring extra .50 caliber guns to the wings of F-4F Wildcats using improvised electrical triggers dramatically increased their killing power against Japanese aircraft. His field modification was adopted fleet-wide and helped turn the tide in the Solomons campaign. And in Vietnam, a helicopter door gunner named James Gruenwald rigged a forward-mounted minigun system onto a UH-1 Huey using parts scavenged from a crashed gunship, creating an improvised weapons platform that his unit used for 3 months before the Army caught up and standardized the design. The pattern is always the same. Someone at the bottom sees the problem. Someone at the top ignores them. The problem gets worse. And eventually disaster forces the institution to listen. Bobby Dalton's story fits this pattern perfectly, but it also reveals something deeper. Innovation in crisis doesn't come from genius. It comes from proximity. Bobby wasn't smarter than the engineers at Boeing. He didn't have access to wind tunnels or stress calculators or research budgets. What he had was something no engineer in Seattle could replicate. He was there. He was the one crawling inside shot-up bombers every night, scraping blood off instrument panels, counting holes in nose sections, watching men he knew climb into aircraft that he knew were going to get hit in the one place they couldn't shoot back. Proximity to the problem created urgency. Urgency created clarity. And clarity created a solution so obvious that it took a tractor mechanic to see it. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. In 2003, a Boeing historian named Dr. Richard Halloran was cataloging declassified company records from the World War II era when he found a sealed envelope in a filing cabinet in Building 3-801 at Boeing's Renton facility in Washington State. Inside was a letter dated November 14, 1944, written by Edward Wells, the chief engineer who had flown to Bassingbourn for the Chin turret demonstration. The letter was addressed to Boeing President Philip Johnson and marked personal and confidential. In it, Wells described the entire Chin turret development story in detail, naming Bobby Dalton by name, describing his prototype, crediting his field data as the catalyst that accelerated the B-17G's forward armament redesign by an estimated 4 months. Wells wrote that without Dalton's unauthorized modification and the combat data it produced, the Bendix Chin turret would not have been ready for production until early 1944. At the earliest meaning, the critical winter missions of late 1943 would have been flown without forward protection. He estimated that the 4-month acceleration saved, in his words, no fewer than 2,000 aircraft and 20,000 lives. At the bottom of the letter, Wells had added a handwritten postscript. Johnson never responded to the letter. It was filed sealed and forgotten for 59 years. The postscript read, "I have recommended Technical Sergeant Dalton for recognition through Army channels on 3 separate occasions. Each recommendation has been ignored. I want this letter to exist so that someday someone will know his name." Bobby Dalton died on March 7, 1991 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was 72 years old. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette was 4 lines long. It mentioned his wife, his 3 children, his 41 years at the John Deere dealership, and his service in the Army Air Forces during World War II. It did not mention the Chin turret. It did not mention the B-17G. It did not mention that his hands had built something that saved more American lives than most generals who wore stars on their shoulders. When Dr. Halloran published his discovery of the Wells letter in a 2005 article in the Journal of the American Aviation Historical Society, Bobby had been dead for 14 years. His wife Helen had passed in 1998. His children contacted by Halloran said they had no idea their father had done anything significant during the war. "He never told us," his daughter Karen said. "He just said he fixed airplanes." From a farm mechanic with a grease-stained notebook and an idea that everyone called impossible to a single modification that saved an estimated 49,000 American lives and transformed the most iconic bomber of the Second World War. Bobby Dalton proved that the most important innovations don't always come from the people with the biggest titles or the largest budgets. They come from the people closest to the problem, the ones who see the blood on the instrument panel and refuse to accept that nothing can be done. He never received a medal. He never saw his name in a history book. He fixed tractors for 41 years and died without anyone knowing what he had done at the age of 24 in a maintenance hangar in England. But every B-17G that flew over Germany carried his fingerprints. Every crew that came home carried his gift. And somewhere in a Boeing archive, a 60-year-old letter finally told the world what one quiet man from Iowa was worth. History remembers the generals. It remembers the aces. It remembers the bombers and the battles and the bombs. But the war was won by the Bobby Daltons. The mechanics, the welders, the fixers, the people who saw a broken thing and made it work. If you know a story like this, someone whose contribution was forgotten, someone who changed everything and got nothing, share it in the comments. These are the stories that deserve to be told. Subscribe for more forgotten histories of the people who built, broke, and rebuilt the machines that changed the world. Because the next time someone tells you that one person can't make a difference, remember a farm boy in a hangar, a notebook full of diagrams and 12 guns that finally learned to shoot straight. That's the power of one stubborn person who refuses to quit.